So you want to marry a medieval peasant. You have seen the version of this story that culture has been selling you since approximately forever. Two young lovers meet across a crowded village green, fall desperately in love, despite their feuding families or disapproving fathers, and eventually marry in a candlelit stone church while a choir of monks hums something ethereal in the background. It is a gorgeous image, and almost none of it is how this actually worked. The truth is that medieval courtship was less about stolen glances and more about livestock negotiations. Your father was not waiting to see if the boy had a good heart. He was waiting to see if the boy's family owned a plow. Romance existed, genuinely and sometimes beautifully, but it lived inside a system so tangled with property law, church doctrine, family strategy, and agricultural economics that falling in love with the wrong person was not a story of star-crossed passion. It was a financial emergency, and the church had opinions about when, how, and in what specific position you were allowed to express your affection, and those opinions were written down in detail that would make a modern relationship therapist deeply uncomfortable. Before we settle in, like and subscribe if you enjoy these, and drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from tonight. I always love seeing where these stories end up. Now, dim the lights. Switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself comfortable and let your shoulders finally drop away from your ears. Tonight is a long one, so just settle in, let the screen do its thing, and we will take it from here. Was there actually a legal age for marriage? And if so, would it horrify you? Did medieval people genuinely marry for love? Or was every wedding a business deal with a dress code? Could a woman say no to a marriage proposal? And would anyone listen if she did? Was the village wedding feast a celebration of love or a public financial audit? Did the church really publish a list of days when married couples were not allowed to have sex? What happened if you got caught dating outside your social class? Was the wedding night actually supervised by witnesses? Could you get a divorce, and what would it cost you? Congratulations. You have just woken up in 1312, somewhere in the English countryside, with a linen shirt you did not choose, parents who have plans for you that nobody asked your opinion about, and a neighbor's daughter your mother will not stop mentioning at supper. Welcome to medieval romance. Try not to fall in love with anyone inconvenient. Let us start with the thing everyone thinks they know, the age. You have heard this one before, probably from a documentary that said it quickly and moved on, or from someone at a dinner party who was trying to sound historically informed. The legal age for marriage in medieval Europe was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. That is true. It is also one of the most misleading things you will ever hear repeated with such casual confidence. Those numbers come from canon law, specifically from the Church's codification of marriage doctrine that stretches back through Gratian's decretum in the 12th century. They represent the minimum age at which a person could theoretically consent to marriage. And the key word there is minimum, not average, not typical, not what actually happened in the vast majority of households across the vast majority of villages in the vast majority of centuries. It was a legal floor, not a cultural norm. The difference matters enormously, because repeating the minimum as though it were the standard is like telling someone in the future that the legal driving age in America was 16 and watching them conclude that most 16-year-olds owned cars. What actually happened, especially among the peasant class that made up somewhere between 80 and 90% of the medieval population, looked nothing like child marriage. Manor court records from English villages tell a remarkably consistent story when historians have taken the trouble to count. Tax rolls, land transfer documents, marriage fines paid to the Lord, and demographic studies of communities where the records survived long enough to be studied, all point in the same direction. Men married in their mid to late 20s, women married in their early to mid-20s. Studies of the village of Halesowen in the West Midlands, one of the most thoroughly examined medieval communities in English historiography, put the average age of first marriage for men at around 26 or 27, and for women at around 22 to 24. These were not children being handed over at the church door. These were adults, often adults who had spent years working, saving, accumulating resources, and waiting. Waiting for what? For the one thing nobody mentions when they quote the canonical age of 12, the economic threshold. Marriage in medieval England did not begin with a feeling. It began with a household. And a household required a foundation that could take years to assemble. You needed land, or at least a viable tenancy. You needed tools, a plow, if you were farming arable land, and a decent iron plow blade could cost the equivalent of several weeks of labor, all on its own. A spinning wheel, or loom, if textile work was part of the household economy. You needed livestock, even if it was only a cow or a few chickens and a pig. A single cow in 14th century England could cost 10 shillings or more, which at a laborer's daily wage of 2 to 3 pence represented somewhere between 40 and 60 full days of work, just for the cow. You needed stored grain to get through the first winter, because a new household that ran out of food before the first harvest was not a struggling household, it was a failed one. You needed basic furniture, and basic is generous. A bed frame, a table, a bench, a chest for storage. You needed bedding. You needed cooking implements, a pot, a skillet, a trivet, a spit if you were ambitious. You needed fire irons. You needed buckets, baskets, barrels for storage and brewing. Every single item on that list cost something, and that something was measured in months or years of labor. So what did you do during those years of waiting? You worked. If you were a young man without a tenancy of your own, you likely worked your father's land and waited for him to retire, divide his holding, or die. Or you hired yourself out as a laborer on neighboring farms, slowly accumulating wages that might, eventually, be enough to negotiate a tenancy from the Lord. If you were a young woman, you might enter domestic service in a wealthier household, earning a small annual wage, plus room and board, saving your earnings year by year to contribute to your future dowry. Service was not slavery. It was the medieval equivalent of a first job after school, except the job lasted a decade, and the goal was not a career, but a marriage chest, with enough in it to start a life. This pattern, young people spending their teens and 20s in service or dependent labor before marrying and establishing independent households, was so common in late medieval England that historians have given it a name: the Western European marriage pattern. It was not universal across the continent, and it was not static across centuries. But in England, it was remarkably persistent. Young people worked, saved, waited, and married late. Not because the culture forced them to wait, but because the economics gave them no alternative. This pattern held remarkably steady for generations, but it was not immune to catastrophe. After the Black Death swept through England in 1348 and 1349, killing somewhere between a third and half the population, the economics of marriage shifted dramatically. Suddenly, there was land available. Tenancies sat empty. Lords who had once charged steep entry fines for a plot of land now competed to attract tenants to work holdings that were generating nothing. Labor was scarce, which meant wages rose, which meant young people could accumulate the marriage threshold faster than their grandparents ever could. Marriage ages dipped. Women in particular found themselves with increased bargaining power, both in the labor market and in the marriage market, because there were simply fewer people and every pair of working hands mattered more. A young woman who could spin, brew, manage livestock, and keep a household running was not just a bride. She was an economic engine, and families who wanted to secure one for their son had to negotiate accordingly. The post-plague generation married younger, married with more choice, and entered marriage with a leverage that would have been unimaginable to their parents. Then, gradually, as the population recovered and land grew scarce again, the old pattern reasserted itself. The window closed. But for a few decades after the worst disaster in European history, the economics of love tilted briefly in favor of the young. A young man in his late teens had none of what was needed. His father might promise him a parcel of land when he married, but that promise was contingent on the father being ready to give it up, which often meant waiting until the father was old, or ill, or dead. A young woman in her teens might bring a dowry, but accumulating that dowry required her family to save, and saving meant years of surplus production beyond what was needed to survive. The economics of getting married made the economics of actually being married look simple by comparison. You did not walk into marriage with nothing but love and a blessing. You walked into marriage with an economic foundation, or you waited until you had one, or you did not walk into it at all. The average medieval English peasant woman married at roughly the same age as the average American woman in 1990. That fact alone should give you pause the next time someone uses the phrase the medieval period as shorthand for barbaric. The past is not as far away as it likes to pretend. Now, the very young marriages did happen. They happened among the aristocracy, where marriage was a political instrument, and children were currency in dynastic negotiations. A 7-year-old could be betrothed to seal an alliance between two noble families, and sometimes that betrothal was followed by a formal ceremony while the child was still, by any reasonable definition, a child. Margaret Beaufort was married at 12 and pregnant at 13, and the birth was so traumatic it nearly killed her. She never had another child. Her story is real, and it is harrowing, and it is also the exception that proves the rule, not a window into ordinary life. Margaret was not a peasant girl following the normal course of village existence. She was a political asset in the Wars of the Roses, and her body was spent in service of a dynastic claim. The rules that applied to her had almost nothing in common with the rules that applied to the woman selling eggs at a Shropshire market. Even among the nobility, the reality was more layered than the betrothal age suggests. A betrothal was not a marriage. It was a contract, often made between families when the children were young, but cohabitation and consummation were frequently delayed for years afterward. A noble girl betrothed at 8 might not live with her husband until she was 15 or 16. In many cases, the families explicitly agreed to postpone the physical relationship, sometimes as a condition of the betrothal contract itself. The church had opinions about this too, insisting that a marriage was not fully valid until it was consummated, which created a legal gray area that noble families navigated with varying degrees of sincerity and a great deal of strategic patience. A betrothal was a promise. A consummation was a seal. The gap between the two could stretch across half a childhood. So when someone tells you that medieval people married at 12, what they are really telling you is that canon law set a floor that almost nobody actually stood on, that the tiny minority who did were aristocratic children being used as political instruments, and that the vast majority of medieval people married at ages that would look perfectly unremarkable at a modern wedding. The myth persists because the shocking number is more interesting than the boring truth. 12 is a headline, 24 is a shrug, but 24 is what actually happened, and the people who lived it deserve the accurate version of their own lives rather than the sensational one. And that brings us to the second thing everyone thinks they know, which is that none of it mattered anyway, because nobody married for love. The story goes like this. Medieval marriage was a cold, transactional arrangement. Two families agreed on terms. The bride and groom met on their wedding day, or perhaps a few days before if they were lucky. Love was irrelevant. Feelings were a luxury the medieval world did not have time for. The whole thing was essentially a business merger dressed in church ritual, and the emotional life of the couple was about as important as the emotional life of the livestock included in the dowry. This is not entirely wrong, but it is wrong in exactly the way that makes people feel comfortable about the present by feeling superior to the past, and that kind of wrongness is worth dismantling carefully. The truth is that medieval marriage existed on a spectrum, and where you landed on that spectrum depended almost entirely on how much money your family had. The more wealth and land at stake, the more the marriage looked like a negotiation between boardrooms. The less wealth involved, the more room there was for something that looked remarkably like choice. And the spectrum was not a neat division between nobles and peasants. It was a sliding scale of assets, and at every point along it, love and economics were pulling in different directions with different degrees of force. Among the peasantry, families absolutely influenced marriages. Your parents had opinions, strong ones, about who you should marry. Your neighbors had opinions. Your lord had opinions, and his came with a fee attached that we will get to later. The community had a collective interest in marriages that made economic sense, that kept land in the right hands, that maintained the delicate web of obligations and alliances that held a village together. But outright forced marriages, the kind where a woman was physically compelled to stand at the church door and say words she did not mean, were rarer than the popular image suggests and technically illegal under the law that mattered most, canon law. The church required the free consent of both parties. Both. That word is doing real work in that sentence. Not just the groom, not just the father acting on the bride's behalf as though she were a parcel being signed for. Both the man and the woman had to consent, freely and without coercion. And the church took this position seriously enough that its courts regularly annulled marriages where consent was proven to have been forced, faked, or absent altogether. This was not a theoretical principle gathering dust in a canon law textbook while priests looked the other way. It was enforced, inconsistently, imperfectly, and with all the usual gaps between law and practice, but enforced. What arrangement actually looked like at the village level was less dramatic than the word implies. In most cases, a marriage between peasant families began not with a command, but with a conversation. Two families who already knew each other, who farmed neighboring strips, who drank at the same ale, who saw each other at church every Sunday, would begin talking. The talk might start between the mothers, or between a father and a neighbor over a fence, or through a go-between, a friend or a relative who could raise the subject without the awkwardness of a direct approach. The young man and the young woman in question might already know each other well. They might have grown up in the same village. They might have opinions of their own, opinions that were listened to with varying degrees of patience depending on the family. The negotiation that followed was not about dowry in the grand aristocratic sense. It was about practical questions. What land would the new couple farm? Would the groom's father release a portion of his holding? What would the bride's family contribute? A cow, some household goods, a sum of saved wages from her years in service? Who would provide the timber for the house repairs? These conversations could take weeks or months, and they happened alongside the courtship itself, not instead of it. The practical and the personal were woven together. Your parents were negotiating the terms of your future while you were trying to catch that same person's eye at the market. There are court records from across medieval England of women refusing proposed marriages and having their refusal upheld by church authorities. There are cases of women challenging matches their families had arranged, petitioning church courts, presenting witnesses, making their arguments, and winning. This did not mean the system was fair. This did not mean that refusal came without consequences, because the consequences could be devastating. A daughter who turned down a strategically valuable match was not just being romantic, she was declining a land merger that might determine whether her family ate well or scratched by for the next generation. She was saying no to a deal her father had already shaken hands on, in a world where a man's word was his credit, and his credit was his survival. The economic pressure was real, the social pressure was enormous. Neighbors talked, reputations shifted. A woman's right to say no existed inside a system that made saying no extraordinarily costly, and the freedom to choose is a complicated concept when one of your choices leads to prosperity, and the other leads to your mother not speaking to you for a period of time best described as the rest of her life. But the freedom existed, and people used it. And sometimes what they used it for was love. The Paston family letters, one of the most remarkable surviving collections of medieval English correspondence, capture this tension with painful, specific clarity. The Pastons were a rising Norfolk family in the 15th century, gentry with ambitions, and their letters survive in extraordinary volume because they were a family that wrote everything down. Marjorie Paston, the youngest daughter, fell in love with Richard Calais, the family's estate manager. He was competent, he was trusted. He was also, in the Pastons' social calculus, absolutely beneath them. Calais was a servant, however skilled. Marjorie was a Paston. The family was horrified. They did everything they could to break the relationship. They separated the couple. They pressured Marjorie to recant. They withheld her from public view. Her mother wrote letters that vibrate with fury even across 500 years. But Marjorie would not bend. When the case was finally brought before the Bishop of Norwich, Marjorie stood in front of the ecclesiastical authority and confirmed her vows to Calais. The church examined the case, confirmed the marriage was valid, and upheld it. There was nothing the Pastons could do. Canon law was clear. Consent freely given, even against the wishes of the family, created a binding marriage. The family essentially disowned her. She chose love. It cost her everything except the man she wanted. And the fact that we know this story in such detail is a reminder that for every Marjorie Paston who made it into the archives, there were hundreds of unnamed women in villages across England making similar choices or similar surrenders with nobody writing it down. Among the nobility, the picture was different. Dynastic marriages were negotiated between families with the precision of trade agreements. The bride and groom might meet days before the ceremony. In some cases, they had never laid eyes on each other. The match was about land, titles, alliances, and the consolidation of political power, and the personal feelings of the two people being merged were, at best, a secondary consideration. But even here, the narrative of loveless arrangement is too simple. It flattens a reality that was more human than the political summary allows. Letters between arranged spouses sometimes reveal genuine warmth developing over time, affection that nobody required them to perform in private correspondence. Tomb inscriptions request joint burial with language that reads like love letters carved in stone, asking God to reunite what death had separated. Wills leave bequests to a beloved wife or beloved husband with a tenderness that no amount of transactional arrangement fully explains. The arrangement was the starting point. What grew inside it was not always cold. Sometimes the business merger developed feelings. Sometimes the dynastic contract produced something that looked, from every available angle, like love. And it was not only the aristocracy's private letters that preserved evidence of affection. At every level of society, medieval people left traces of love in the records they never expected anyone to read centuries later. Court testimony in marriage disputes sometimes includes witnesses describing couples who were visibly affectionate, who held hands at public events, who were known in the village as devoted to each other. Wills from middling peasant families leave everything to my dear wife, or to my beloved husband, with bequests of personal items, a best cloak, a cherished cup, a feather bed, that were clearly chosen with tenderness rather than legal obligation. There are records of widows and widowers remarrying within months, not because the church pressured them, but because they had experienced partnership and wanted it again. There are tomb inscriptions from parish churches across England where couples requested to be buried side by side, sometimes with carved hands reaching toward each other across the stone. These are not the gestures of people trapped in loveless transactions. These are the gestures of people who found something real inside the structure, even when the structure was not designed to care whether they did. The poorer you were, the more likely you were to actually choose your own spouse. That is the status flip that most people never hear, because it contradicts the simple story. Freedom of romantic choice was inversely correlated with wealth. The peasant girl flirting at a village festival had more say in her own future than the duke's daughter being shipped across the channel to marry a man whose face she had never seen. The girl with nothing to her name had the one thing the heiress could not buy: the right to fall in love with whoever she wanted, and the absence of assets valuable enough for anyone powerful to interfere. The tension between marry who you love and marry who makes financial sense is not a medieval problem. It is a Thanksgiving dinner problem. It is the conversation every family has had, in some form, in every century, in every culture that has ever treated marriage as anything more than two people deciding to share a bed. The vocabulary changes. The spreadsheets get more sophisticated. The feeling of your mother quietly but persistently suggesting that the other one had better prospects is exactly the same whether the year is 1320 or 2024. And that is the thing about medieval marriage that the simple narratives always miss. It was not all love, and it was not all calculation. It was both, tangled together, pulling in different directions, with real people caught in the middle, trying to navigate a system they did not design and could not escape. The same way you do, the same way everyone always has. But if love was possible, and choice was real, at least for some, then how exactly did you find someone in the first place? There were no personal advertisements pinned to the church door. There was no system for announcing your availability to the surrounding countryside. There was no intermediary service matching you with compatible strangers from the next village over. What there was, in a medieval English village, was proximity. Relentless, inescapable, thoroughly surveilled proximity. You knew everyone. Everyone knew you. You had known the same 30 to 60 families since birth, and they had known you, and their mothers had opinions about you that were formed before you could walk, and refined with every passing year based on evidence you were not aware was being collected. Your romantic life was not a private matter. It was a community event observed by an audience that never left, never looked away, and never, under any circumstances, kept its observations to itself. The idea that medieval peasants did not court each other, that there was no such thing as dating before the modern era, is one of those assumptions that falls apart the moment you look at what people actually did with their Saturdays. Medieval villages were not silent clusters of mud and misery, where people shuffled between church and field with nothing in between. They were social worlds, dense and active, and the calendar was punctuated with events that served, among other purposes, as the medieval equivalent of going out. Market days brought people together from surrounding settlements. You might walk 2 or 3 miles to attend a weekly market, and when you arrived, the practical business of buying and selling happened alongside the entirely impractical business of seeing who else was there, who was wearing something new, who had grown taller since the last time, and who kept appearing at the same stall you happened to be browsing. Church was every Sunday, and the time before and after the service was social time, the slow milling about outside the church door, where conversations happened, glances were exchanged, and mothers positioned themselves with a strategic casualness that fooled absolutely no one. Then there were the festivals: May Day, Midsummer, harvest celebrations, saints' days, church ales, which were community drinking events organized by the parish to raise funds, where the ale flowed freely and the normal social rules relaxed just enough to create opportunities. These were not wild, lawless celebrations. They were structured community gatherings with a long tradition of looking the other way, when young people disappeared into the edges of the event together. May Day, in particular, had a reputation. The maypole dancing, the greenery gathering, the tradition of going out into the woods at dawn to collect branches and flowers, all of it carried a frankly acknowledged undercurrent of romantic and sometimes sexual opportunity. Church authorities complained about it regularly, which is how we know it was happening. Flirting, when it happened, was not subtle in the way modern flirting can be subtle. In a village where everyone knew your business, subtlety was both impossible and somewhat pointless. What you could do was signal. A young man might give a young woman a small gift, a pair of gloves, a ribbon, a lace, a carved wooden spoon. These token gifts were widely understood as declarations of interest. Accepting the gift was a signal back. Wearing the ribbon publicly was a louder signal. Carved wooden love spoons, decorated with symbols of affection, survive in collections across Britain. And while most of the surviving examples are from later centuries, the tradition stretches back deep into the medieval period. A young man who spent his evenings carving a decorative spoon for a specific young woman was not being ambiguous about his intentions. He was investing hours of labor into a physical object that said, in wood and patience, what he might not have had the nerve to say out loud. Walking together was another signal. After church, after a festival, on the path between villages, being seen walking together repeatedly was understood by the community as a courtship in progress. It was the medieval equivalent of changing your relationship status. You did not need to announce anything. The village announced it for you, because the village was always watching, and the village had strong feelings about everything. There was also the matter of what happened when courtship crossed the boundaries the community considered appropriate. A woman from one village courting a man from another was not merely unusual, it was economically significant. If she married out, she took her labor and potentially her dowry to another settlement, another lord's domain, another set of fields. The lord of her own manor would lose a tenant's daughter and the future labor of her children. This was not a sentimental loss, it was a line item. In many manors, the fine for marrying outside the lord's jurisdiction, the fores maritagium, was higher than the standard marriage fine. You could fall in love with anyone you wanted, but falling in love across a parish boundary came with a surcharge. The medieval world was deeply practical about regulating even the heart, and the regulation always had a price tag. And then there was the question of what happened when courtship went further than the community approved. Premarital sex was a sin, officially, and the church courts prosecuted it when it came to their attention. But the evidence suggests that in many villages, the community's actual attitude was more nuanced than the church's official position. A couple known to be courting seriously, whose families were negotiating terms, who were understood to be on the path to marriage, might be quietly tolerated if they anticipated the wedding night by a few months. What was not tolerated was sex without the promise of marriage, or sex that produced a child outside a committed relationship, because an illegitimate child was an economic burden on the community. The distinction was not really about morality, it was about responsibility. The village did not especially care what you did in the dark, as long as someone was going to pay for the consequences in the morning. Go-betweens played a role that the modern world has largely outsourced to dating apps and mutual friends with loose lips. A trusted friend, a sympathetic relative, an older woman in the village who had a reputation for making matches, any of these could serve as an intermediary. They could raise the subject of a potential match with the other family without the risk of a direct rejection. They could carry messages. They could report back on whether interest was reciprocated. The role of the groomsman and the bridesmaid, which later centuries formalized into wedding party positions, originated in part as exactly this kind of intermediary function. Your friends helped you get married. That was not a metaphor. It was a job description. But for every warm, hopeful moment in this process, there was a corresponding weight of surveillance and judgment. The gossip economy of a medieval village was merciless. A woman's reputation was a tangible asset, and it could be destroyed by rumor faster than it could be built by a lifetime of careful behavior. Court records are full of defamation cases arising from sexual gossip, men and women hauling their neighbors before the church court for publicly calling them a whore or a lecher or accusing them of fornication. These were not casual insults, they were economic attacks. A woman whose sexual reputation was damaged might find her marriage prospects diminished. A man, accused of seducing or abandoning a woman, might face community sanctions. The words people said about your love life had material consequences, and everyone knew it, and everyone said them anyway. trying to impress someone you liked by showing up overdressed to a village event where every single person present already knew exactly what you normally looked like and precisely how much your family was worth, was a tradition that stretches unbroken from the 14th century to the modern bar scene. The costume changes, the anxiety is identical. You stood a little straighter, you laughed a little louder, you wore the one good thing you owned and hoped nobody remembered you borrowing it. Human vanity in the service of human attraction has not evolved a single inch in 700 years. It has only gotten more expensive. And underneath all of this performative socializing, the real question was never just whether you liked each other, it was whether your families could work together, because a marriage in a medieval village was not the joining of two individuals. It was the merging of two household economies, and the community had a stake in whether that merger made sense. Which is why, despite everything we have just said about consent and choice and love, the question of who actually controlled the process was more complicated than any single answer can capture. You have probably heard that the father decided everything, that he was the unquestioned authority in all matters of marriage, that his word was law, that daughters were property to be disposed of, and sons were instruments of family strategy, with no more agency than the plow they drove. It is a powerful image. It is also too simple by half. The father mattered. Of course he mattered. In a world where land passed through families, where economic survival depended on strategic alliances between households, where a bad marriage could impoverish a family for a generation, the head of the household had enormous influence over who married whom. His approval was practically necessary, even when it was not legally required, because a father who disapproved could withhold the land grant, refuse to contribute to the household setup, or simply make the young couple's life so socially uncomfortable that the marriage began under a cloud it might never escape. But the father was not the only voice, and in many cases, he was not even the loudest one. Mothers were the invisible engine of medieval matchmaking. The popular narrative of arranged marriage almost always focuses on patriarchal authority, the father negotiating with another father, two men shaking hands over a deal that determined their children's futures. The evidence from court records, correspondence, and literary sources tells a different story. Mothers identified potential matches. Mothers made the initial inquiries. Mothers assessed the character of the prospective spouse, often with a thoroughness that would make a modern background check feel casual. Mothers coordinated the social events where young people would have the opportunity to meet under appropriately supervised conditions. The father might have the final say on the economic terms. The mother, in many households, had already decided who the father was going to be negotiating with. This is not a modern projection onto medieval families. It is visible in the sources. The Paston letters, which we have already met, show Margaret Paston actively managing the marriage prospects of her children with a strategic intensity that makes her husband John look almost passive by comparison. She assessed candidates. She gathered intelligence on their families' financial positions. She arranged introductions. She vetoed unsuitable options before they reached the formal negotiation stage. The public performance was patriarchal. The operational reality, in the Paston household, and likely in thousands of households whose letters did not survive, was more collaborative and more female-driven than the simple model allows. And then there was the church, sitting in the middle of all of this, with a position that was, depending on your perspective, either quietly revolutionary or deeply inconvenient. The church required consent, not just the father's consent, not just the family's agreement, the individual, personal, freely given consent of both the man and the woman. This requirement came from a theological principle that had real legal teeth. Marriage, in the church's understanding, was a sacrament entered into by two people before God. A marriage without genuine consent was no marriage at all, regardless of what the families had agreed, regardless of what the priest had blessed, regardless of what the community had witnessed. Pope Alexander III in the 12th century formalized this into canon law with a clarity that left little room for creative interpretation. Present tense consent, the words "I take you as my husband" or "I take you as my wife," spoken freely by both parties, created a valid marriage. Future tense consent, the words "I will take you," created a binding betrothal that became a marriage upon consummation. In neither case was the father's permission legally required. In neither case could a family override the consent of the individuals involved, at least not in the eyes of the church. This sounds remarkably progressive, and in some ways it was. The medieval church was, on paper, more insistent on a woman's right to consent to her own marriage than many legal systems that came centuries later. Church courts heard cases brought by women who claimed their marriages were invalid because their consent had been coerced. Women who said they had been married against their will, pressured by fathers or lords, or the simple economic impossibility of refusal, could petition for annulment on the grounds that a fundamental requirement of the sacrament had been violated. And they sometimes won. Not always, not even most of the time, because proving coercion was difficult, and the courts were not immune to social pressure. But sometimes. The gap between the legal principle and the lived reality was, of course, enormous. A woman's right to consent freely existed inside a world where economic dependence, social obligation, family honor, and the simple physical reality of having nowhere else to go made the word freely do a lot of work it was not always strong enough to carry. Saying no to a marriage your father had arranged was legally possible. It was also, in practical terms, an act of extraordinary courage that most women were never in a position to perform. The right was real. The freedom to exercise it was conditional on circumstances that rarely favored the person who needed it most. There was also a darker edge to the question of consent. The concept of raptus in medieval law covered a range of situations that the modern mind struggles to sort into clean categories. Raptus could mean abduction, the physical seizure of a woman for the purpose of forced marriage. It could mean elopement, a woman leaving with a man willingly against her family's wishes. It could mean something closer to what we would now call sexual assault. The legal category blurred these distinctions in ways that sometimes served women and sometimes served the men accused of taking them. A family could bring a charge of raptus against a man who had eloped with their daughter, framing a consensual departure as a criminal abduction. Conversely, an actual abduction could be reframed as an elopement if the woman was pressured into consenting after the fact. The law was a tool, and like all tools, it could be used by different hands for different purposes. What emerges from all of this is not a simple picture of patriarchal tyranny or progressive consent rights. It is a picture of competing authorities, the father pulling in one direction, the mother pulling in another, often the same direction but through different channels. The church pulling toward individual consent with one hand and collecting fees with the other. The Lord pulling toward whatever outcome generated the most revenue in marriage fines. And in the middle, two young people who might or might not love each other, trying to navigate a system with more moving parts than any single authority could fully control. The father did not decide everything. Nobody decided everything. That was the problem, and also, depending on where you stood, the opportunity. But if the question of who decided was complicated, the question of where the marriage actually happened is even more surprising, because the answer, for most of the medieval period, was not a church. It was barely even a ceremony, and this is where everything you think you know about medieval weddings falls apart most completely. You are imagining a stone church, stained glass, a priest in vestments, candles, vows spoken at an altar, while witnesses sit in wooden pews, and someone weeps quietly in the third row. This is the image that every period drama has planted in your head, and for most of the medieval period, it is simply wrong. Not wrong in the details, wrong in the foundation. Because for centuries, the church did not control marriage. Marriage was not a church sacrament in any formally defined sense until surprisingly late. The church did not require a priest to be present. It did not require a ceremony. It did not require a building. It did not, strictly speaking, require witnesses, though it strongly recommended them for reasons that will become obvious. What the church required was consent. Two people, present tense words. That was it. Two people standing in a field, a kitchen, a barn, a roadside, anywhere at all, saying, "I take you as my wife, and I take you as my husband," in the present tense, with genuine intent, were married, fully, legally, sacramentally married in the eyes of canon law, with all the rights and obligations that marriage entailed. No ring, no feast, no father walking anyone down anything, no priest blessing anything. Just two voices and a verbal contract that the church itself would uphold in court if challenged. This was called a clandestine marriage, and it drove the institutional church absolutely to distraction for the better part of 3 centuries. The problem was obvious. If marriage required nothing but words, then marriage was nearly impossible to prove and nearly impossible to disprove. A man could claim he had married a woman in private, and she could deny it. A woman could claim a man had married her in a whispered exchange, and he could insist it never happened. Two people could genuinely exchange vows in a moment of passion or affection, with no witnesses, and then one of them could walk away and marry someone else in public, creating a legal nightmare that the church courts had to untangle with nothing but conflicting testimony and character assessments. And the chaos this created was extraordinary. Church court records from across medieval England are full of disputed marriages, cases where one party claimed a clandestine marriage had taken place and the other denied it, cases where a man married 2 women, one secretly and one publicly, and both marriages had potential legal validity, cases where the legitimacy of children, the inheritance of property, and the entire economic future of 2 families hinged on whether a few words had been spoken in a cowshed on a Tuesday evening 5 years earlier. Imagine this unraveling in court. A woman appears before the church tribunal and says that 3 years ago, in a barn after harvest, a man took her hand and said the words. He denies it. She brings a witness, a friend, who says she was there, hiding behind a hay bale because the couple had asked her to listen. He brings a witness who says the woman is known for dishonesty. The court examines their characters. It interviews neighbors. It asks whether the two behaved as married people afterward, whether they lived together, whether they were seen sharing a bed, whether they referred to each other as husband and wife in conversation. The physical evidence of a marriage that was designed to have no physical evidence is reconstructed, piece by piece, from the memories and observations of people who may or may not be telling the truth. The entire proceeding is conducted in a church court under oath, with the salvation of souls and the disposition of property both hanging in the balance. And whatever the court decides, someone walks away with their life rearranged by a verdict about words that may or may not have been spoken in the dark. The church spent centuries trying to fix this. Synod after synod issued recommendations, then requirements, that marriages be public, that they be announced in advance, that they take place at the church door in front of witnesses, that a priest be involved. The Fourth Lateran Council, in 1215, one of the most important legislative gatherings in medieval church history, introduced the requirement of banns. 3 public announcements of the intended marriage, made on 3 consecutive Sundays or feast days before the wedding, in the parishes of both the bride and the groom. The purpose was to flush out impediments, to give anyone who knew a reason the marriage should not happen the opportunity to say so before it was too late. A prior secret marriage, a blood relationship too close for the church's rules, an existing betrothal to someone else. The bans were a system for preventing the chaos of clandestine unions by making marriage a public, announced, verifiable event. And it worked, partially, gradually, imperfectly. The requirement of bans pushed marriage steadily toward the public, church-centered ceremony that we now think of as traditional. But clandestine marriages did not disappear overnight, because the church never actually declared them invalid. A marriage without bans, without a priest, without witnesses, was illegal. It was punishable. The couple could face penances, but it was still, under canon law, a valid marriage. The church had created a rule that everyone was supposed to follow, and then declined to impose the one consequence that would have made the rule enforceable. A clandestine marriage was a sin. It was not a nullity, and as long as that distinction held, people kept doing it, because the human impulse to make binding promises in private, without consulting anyone in authority, is apparently one of the most durable features of the species. The medieval church, spending 3 centuries trying to get people to please, for the love of God, at least tell someone before getting married, is the exact energy of a modern government trying to get freelancers to file their taxes. The rules are clear. The penalties exist. The compliance rate is a source of permanent institutional frustration. And the people ignoring the rules are not doing it out of malice. They are doing it because the alternative was easier, or more romantic, or simply because nobody was watching and the moment felt right. It is worth noting that even when marriages did begin moving into the church's physical and ritual space, the ceremony did not look the way a modern person would expect. For much of the medieval period, the key part of the wedding, the exchange of vows, actually happened not inside the church, but at the church door. The couple stood in the porch, or the doorway, in front of the gathered community, and exchanged their consent with the priest serving as witness and officiant. Only after the vows were complete did the party move inside the church for a nuptial mass. The symbolism was deliberate. The marriage was a public contract, made in public, at the threshold between the secular world and the sacred space. The mass that followed was a blessing, not the marriage itself. The marriage had already happened, out in the open, where everyone could see and hear it, which was exactly the point. The priest's role in these ceremonies was not what a modern churchgoer would recognize either. He did not marry the couple in the sense of creating the marriage. The couple married each other through their mutual consent. The priest received their vows, blessed the union, and celebrated the Mass. He was, in legal and theological terms, an especially important witness, not the agent of the sacrament. This distinction mattered enormously in canon law, and mattered almost not at all to the people standing at the church door, who were mostly thinking about the feast afterward and whether the ale would be good. The theology was complicated. The human experience of getting married was exactly as nervous, exciting, and mildly chaotic as it has always been. By the later medieval period, the church had largely succeeded in making the public, priest-officiated, bands-announced wedding the expected norm. But the road from a handshake in a field to a ceremony in a nave took centuries of institutional effort, legal reform, and the slow grinding work of changing a culture that had been marrying itself perfectly well without ecclesiastical involvement since long before the church arrived. The wedding you imagine when you think of a medieval marriage, the one with the stone church and the stained glass, is the end point of that process, not the starting point. For most of the medieval centuries, marriage happened wherever people happened to be standing when they said the words. The church just spent a very long time trying to get them to stand somewhere more convenient. And once you had navigated all of that, the courtship, the negotiations, the consent, the church's slowly tightening grip on the ceremony itself, you arrived at the part nobody tells you about, honestly, the money. Because a medieval marriage was, underneath the vows and the blessings and the community gathering at the church door, a financial transaction of extraordinary complexity. Not a single payment, not a simple exchange, a layered, multi-directional system of wealth, transfers so intricate that modern wedding planners would need a spreadsheet and a lawyer to keep up. Start with the word everyone knows, dowry. You have heard this term. You probably think it means the bride's family paid the groom's family to take their daughter, like a reverse purchase, the family paying to offload an expensive dependent. That is not quite right, and the ways in which it is not right reveal the real economics of medieval marriage more clearly than any other single detail. A dowry was the bride's contribution to the new household. It was not a gift to the groom. It was not payment for services rendered. It was the bride's share of her family's wealth, given to her at marriage rather than at her parents' death. And it came with strings that the modern word gift does not begin to capture. A dowry was, in legal and economic terms, an advance on the bride's inheritance. It represented her claim on her family's assets, extracted early and delivered into the marriage as a foundation for the new household. In many cases, receiving a dowry meant relinquishing further inheritance claims. You got your share now. You did not get another share later. The dowry was not generosity. It was settlement. What went into a dowry depended entirely on what the family had. Among wealthy noble families, a dowry could include land, manors, income from rents, gold, jewels, and enough cash to make a modern trust fund look modest. Among the peasantry, the scale was smaller, but the economic significance was no less acute. A peasant bride's dowry might consist of a cow, a few sheep, household linens, a spinning wheel, cooking implements, a chest of stored goods, and perhaps a small sum of saved money accumulated over her years in domestic service. These items sound humble, listed in a sentence. Expressed as labor, they were anything but. A cow in 14th century England could cost 10 shillings. At a laborer's wage of 2 to 3 pence per day, that cow represented 40 to 60 days of work. A decent spinning wheel might cost 2 to 3 shillings, another 2 weeks of labor. The household linens, the bedding, the cooking implements, the chest itself, the stored food, each item adding days and weeks to the total. A middling peasant dowry, the kind that would be considered adequate but not impressive, could represent the equivalent of 6 months to a full year of a laborer's wages. And that was the modest version. A prosperous peasant family with pretensions and a daughter to settle well might assemble a dowry worth 2 or 3 years of labor. Every item in that chest represented days that someone in the family did not eat well, did not buy new clothing, did not repair the roof, so that the daughter could walk into her marriage with enough to make it work. Now add the other side. The groom's family was expected to contribute too, though the mechanism and the terminology varied across regions and centuries. In the earlier medieval period, the Germanic tradition of the bride price was still operative in many areas. The groom or his family paid a sum to the bride's family, a transfer that went in the opposite direction from the dowry. This was not purchasing a wife, though it is easy to read it that way with modern eyes. It was compensation to the bride's family for the loss of her labor and her potential children's labor, and it was a demonstration that the groom's family had the resources to support a new household. The bride price declined as the dowry system became dominant across the later medieval period. But in many communities, both transfers coexisted for a time, money and goods flowing in both directions simultaneously, as two families redistributed their assets around the formation of a new economic unit. Then there was the morning gift, the Morgengabe, given by the groom to the bride on the morning after consummation. This was the bride's personal property, not shared marital property, hers. It acknowledged the consummation of the marriage and provided the bride with an independent economic asset. In practice, the morning gift might be a piece of land, a sum of money, or valuable goods. Its significance was partly symbolic and partly fiercely practical. A woman whose marriage ended, through death or separation, could fall back on her morning gift as a baseline of economic security. It was the medieval equivalent of a financial safety net, agreed upon in advance and triggered by the one act that confirmed the marriage was fully real. And then there was the dower. Not the dowry, the dower. The words look nearly identical, and they cause endless confusion, but they are entirely separate instruments. The dower was the portion of the husband's property that was legally reserved for the wife if he died before she did. In English common law, the dower was typically 1/3 of the husband's real property held by the widow for the remainder of her life. She did not own it, she held it. She could not sell it or give it away, but she could live on it, farm it, collect its rents, and support herself with its income until her own death, at which point it reverted to the husband's heirs. The dower existed to prevent the nightmare scenario of a widow being thrown out of her home by her husband's family the moment he stopped breathing. It did not always prevent this nightmare, because law and practice are different countries with a shared border and very little mutual respect. But the principle was clear. A widow was entitled to a share of her husband's estate, and that share was defined before the marriage even took place. Some families preferred the jointure, an alternative to dower that was negotiated as part of the marriage contract. A jointure was a specific piece of property or income assigned to the wife in the event of her husband's death, agreed upon in advance, and often more precisely defined than the general dower right. The advantage for the husband's family was certainty. Instead of the widow claiming 1/3 of everything, she received a specific, predetermined portion. The advantage for the wife was security. Instead of fighting in court over what 1/3 meant, she knew exactly what was hers. Layer all of these on top of each other, and what you get is not a wedding. What you get is a financial restructuring. The bride's family contributes the dowry. The groom's family contributes the bride price or its equivalent. The groom provides the mourning gift. The marriage contract specifies the dower or jointure. Two households are merging their balance sheets, redistributing assets, allocating risk, and building contingency plans for death, abandonment, and economic failure, all before anyone has said a single vow. The romance is real. The spreadsheet is also real, and the spreadsheet came first. But the financial transaction did not stop at the two families. The lord of the manor wanted his cut. In many English manors, a peasant could not marry without the lord's permission, and that permission came with a fee. The merchant, the marriage fine, was a payment made to the lord for the right to marry, and in particular for the right to marry a daughter out of the manor. The fine varied enormously, depending on the manor, the lord, and the bride's circumstances. A standard merchant might be a few shillings. Marrying outside the manor's jurisdiction could cost significantly more. The lord was not providing a service. He was extracting a toll from a life event over which he had no moral authority and complete practical control. You could not ignore him, because ignoring him meant your marriage started with a legal cloud that could complicate your tenancy, your inheritance, and your children's status for years to come. Then the church collected its fees. Banns needed to be read, and reading banns cost money. The priest who officiated needed payment. The church where the ceremony took place expected a contribution. Special dispensations, if they were needed, for marrying during a restricted season, for example, or for marrying someone within a prohibited degree of kinship, cost more. The church was not expensive by design, but the church was also not free. And for a peasant family that had already stretched its finances to assemble a dowry, pay the merchant, and prepare a feast, every additional shilling was measured in days of labor that someone in the family would have to perform. Add it all up, the dowry, the merchant, the church fees, the wedding feast, the bride's outfit, because even a peasant bride was expected to wear something better than her daily working clothes. The small gifts to attendants and helpers, the ale, which was often the single largest expense of the celebration itself. A medieval peasant wedding, all costs included, could represent anywhere from 1 to 3 years of a laborer's total income, depending on the family's ambitions and the community's expectations. That is not a celebration. That is a capital expenditure. And like all capital expenditures, it was financed through a combination of savings, family contributions, and the quiet, grinding deferral of every other want and need until the debt was cleared. The Lord collected the merchant. The church collected its fees. The groom's family received the dowry. The bride's family paid for the feast. The couple themselves often started married life, having contributed nothing of their own and owing gratitude, obligation, and sometimes literal debt to every institution and family member who had made the merger possible. Everyone got paid, except the two people the entire event was supposedly about. And speaking of paying for things, let us talk about the feast itself. because whatever the economics behind it, the wedding feast was the one day in a medieval peasant's life where abundance was not just permitted, but required. And the community took it very seriously. A medieval wedding feast was not a dinner party. It was a public statement, it said, to every person present and every person who would hear about it afterward, that these two families had the resources to celebrate, the standing to gather the community, and the confidence to put food and drink on a table and let people judge the quality. A thin feast was remembered, not fondly. A generous feast was remembered too, and it bought social capital that could last for years. The feast was an investment in reputation as much as a celebration of love, and the families involved understood this with a clarity that modern couples spending $30,000 on a wedding would recognize instantly. What appeared on the table depended on what the family could afford, but certain elements were expected regardless of class. Bread. There would be bread, and it would be the best bread the family could manage, not the coarse, dark Maslin loaf of daily life, but the whitest, finest wheat bread that could be baked or purchased. Ale lait. This was often the centerpiece of the celebration, brewed specifically for the occasion, sometimes for weeks in advance. The term bridal itself descends from bride ale, the special ale brewed for the wedding feast. The quality of the ale reflected directly on the family. Weak ale was an insult to the guests. Strong, well-brewed ale was a statement that this family knew how to do things properly. If the family could afford meat, there would be roasted meat, a pig, a sheep, chickens, whatever the budget allowed. A truly prosperous peasant family might slaughter an ox, though this was rare and impressive enough to be talked about for years. There would be pottage, the thick stew of vegetables and grains that was the backbone of peasant cooking, but enriched for the occasion with better ingredients, more fat, more flavor than the everyday version. There might be cheese, there might be eggs, prepared in several ways. There might be fruit tarts or honey cakes, if the family had access to the ingredients and the skill to prepare them. A medieval food blogger, had such a person existed, would photograph the spread in soft light and call it a rustic celebration table with artisanal grain ales and heritage breed pork, and charge you £60 to recreate it at a pop-up supper club in East London. The feast was not just about food. It was a social event with its own rituals and rhythms. The wedding procession, the walk from the church door to the feast location, was a public parade. The couple walked through the village, accompanied by guests, music if anyone had an instrument, and the general noise of a community in a festive mood. Grain or seeds were thrown over the couple, a fertility blessing that survives in the modern tradition of throwing rice or confetti. Songs were sung, some of them bawdy enough to make the priest pretend he had not heard them. Games and entertainments followed the meal, wrestling matches, dancing, competitions, and the general happy disorder of a community that had been given permission to enjoy itself for a day. And all of it was being mentally tallied by every guest present: the quality of the ale, the quantity of the meat, the whiteness of the bread, whether the bride's dress was new or borrowed, whether the groom's family had provided enough or had visibly skimped. The feast was a celebration and an audit conducted simultaneously, and the results of both were filed permanently in the collective memory of the village. A family that overspent on the feast might eat thin for months afterward, but they would eat thin with their reputation intact. A family that underspent would save money and lose something more expensive. Spending more than you can afford on a single day to perform your family's status in front of everyone you know is not a modern invention. The medieval wedding industrial complex was smaller in scale, but identical in emotional engineering. The impulse to bankrupt yourself for the appearance of abundance on the one day everyone is watching is as old as the institution it celebrates. The gift economy around the feast added another layer. Guests did not arrive empty-handed. They brought contributions, food, ale, small useful items for the new household. These gifts were not acts of pure generosity. They were entries in a ledger of social obligation. If your neighbor brought a cheese to your daughter's wedding, you would bring a cheese to his son's. If a family contributed a barrel of ale, they expected equivalent hospitality when their turn came. The gift economy was a system of reciprocal debt that bound the community together and ensured that no family bore the full cost of a wedding alone. It also ensured that no family ever forgot who had been generous and who had been cheap. The cost of a respectable peasant wedding feast, including the ale and the food and the gifts to attendants, could represent several weeks to a few months of a laborer's wages, on top of every other expense the marriage had already incurred. Expressed as a proportion of annual income, it was roughly comparable to what a modern middle-class family might spend on a wedding, which tells you something either comforting or depressing about the human relationship with celebratory overspending. We have not learned. We have not even tried to learn. We have simply continued doing exactly what people in the 14th century were doing, spending too much money on a party to prove to our neighbors that we could. By the time the feast wound down, the ale was running low, the songs were getting slower, and the evening was settling over the village. There remained one final ritual that the modern imagination has turned into either a joke or a horror story: the bedding. And that is where we are headed next, into the part of the evening that everyone has heard whispered about and almost nobody has heard described accurately. Underscore ran a command, 2,770 words. Need, resume 1,230 more, adding expansions to both sections. Insertion 1, Section 6. After, the dowry was not generosity, it was settlement, and before, what went into a dowry? The legal protections around a dowry reflected its seriousness. A dowry was not simply handed over and forgotten. In many regions, the bride or her family retained recovery rights. If the marriage ended, through the husband's death or through annulment, the dowry or its equivalent was supposed to come back. This created a situation where a husband technically controlled the dowry during the marriage, but could not dispose of it freely, because doing so risked a legal claim from his wife's family. He could use the cow. He could not sell the cow and spend the money on something else without consequences. The dowry sat inside the marriage like a piece of property with two owners and one address, generating the kind of legal complexity that kept church courts busy for centuries. And when a dowry could not be assembled at all, the consequences were stark. A woman without a dowry was a woman without leverage in the marriage market. She could still marry. Consent law did not require a financial contribution, but she entered the marriage with nothing to offer except her labor, which meant the negotiation with the groom's family started from a position of weakness that was difficult to recover from. In some cases, charitable institutions and wealthy benefactors endowed poor women with small dowries as an act of piety, recognizing that, without this intervention, the women would likely never marry at all. The charity was not sentimental. It was structural. An unmarried woman without resources was a burden on the community. A married woman with a modest dowry was a functioning economic unit. The math was clear, and medieval charity followed the math. Insertion 2, Section 7. After, the general happy disorder of a community that had been given permission to enjoy itself for a day, and before, and all of it was being mentally tallied. The drink mattered more than the food in many cases, and the tradition of the bride ale deserves a moment of its own. In some communities, the bride ale was not merely the ale served at the wedding. It was a fundraising mechanism. The bride's family brewed a large quantity of ale, and the wedding guests purchased it, with the proceeds going to the newlyweds as a kind of startup fund. The quality of the ale determined how much people would pay. Good ale meant generous purchases. Bad ale meant polite sips and thin contributions. The bride ale transformed the feast from a pure expense into a partial investment, a way of recouping some of the wedding costs through the community's thirst and goodwill. It was, if you squint at it correctly, a medieval crowdfunding campaign lubricated with alcohol and social obligation. The entertainment at a wedding feast could stretch for hours. especially if the ale held out. There would be dancing, and the dances were communal, not the paired formal dances of later centuries, but group dances that pulled everyone into a moving circle or line. There might be a local musician with a fiddle or a pipe, or simply voices raised in songs that everyone knew. The songs got bawdier as the evening progressed, and the ale did its work. There were toasts, there were speeches, or at least the medieval equivalent, short declarations of goodwill and barely concealed advice about married life, delivered with the confidence that only several cups of strong ale can provide. Children ran between the tables. Dogs ate whatever fell on the ground. Old women commented on the bride's complexion. Old men commented on the groom's prospects. It was, in every recognizable particular, a wedding reception. The decorations were different. The playlist was different. The fundamental human experience of watching two people you know start a life together while eating too much and drinking slightly more than you intended was exactly the same. Ran a command, 3,377 words, still 620 short. One more expansion needed. Insertion 3, Section 6, after, your children's status for years to come, and before, then the church collected its fees. The merchant is one of those medieval institutions that reveals the true nature of lordship more clearly than almost any other payment in the manorial system. The Lord was not blessing the marriage. He was not facilitating it. He was taxing it. The merchant was a reminder, delivered at the exact moment when a family was at its most financially stretched and emotionally exposed, that the Lord's authority extended into the most personal decisions of his tenants' lives. The amount varied, but the principle was consistent. Manor court rolls from across England record merchant payments ranging from a few pence for the poorest families to several shillings for wealthier tenants, or for marriages that crossed manorial boundaries. In some manors, the merchant for a woman marrying outside the Lord's jurisdiction could be double or triple the standard rate, a direct financial penalty for a decision that would remove a productive tenant from the Lord's labor pool. The merchant also reveals something about the gendered economics of medieval marriage that is easy to miss. In most manors, the fine was charged specifically on the marriage of women, not men. A daughter leaving the manor cost the lord a future tenant and her children's labor. A son staying on the manor and bringing in a wife from elsewhere added to the lord's workforce. The asymmetry was deliberate. The lord was not interested in the romance. He was interested in the workforce. And the merchant ensured that every romance, every match, every whispered vow and careful negotiation passed through his ledger on its way to the church door. There were families who delayed marriages, specifically because they could not afford the merchant, on top of everything else. There were families who negotiated the fine down, petitioning the Lord for leniency, offering labor or goods in lieu of cash, stretching the payment across multiple terms. The court rolls record these negotiations in the flat, procedural language of medieval bureaucracy, but behind every entry is a family doing arithmetic at the kitchen table, counting pennies, calculating whether this year, or next year, or the year after would be the year they could finally afford to let their daughter marry. The bedding ceremony. You have heard of it. You have probably heard of it described in one of two ways. Either as a charmingly rustic tradition where friends tucked the happy couple into bed with a wink and a prayer, or as a horrifying invasion of privacy, where a crowd of drunk relatives watch two strangers consummate their marriage. Neither version is quite right, and the truth, as usual, is stranger and more human than either extreme. Let us set the scene. The feast is winding down. The ale has been flowing for hours. The songs have progressed from cheerful to affectionate to frankly suggestive, and the priest, if he is still present, has developed a sudden and convenient interest in a conversation on the other side of the room. The evening light is fading. The couple, who have spent the entire day being the center of a community spectacle, are about to experience the final act of that spectacle in the one place a modern person would consider most private, the bedroom. Except it was not a bedroom in the way you understand the word. A wealthy family might have a separate chamber for the marriage bed, a room set aside and prepared with clean linens, fresh herbs scattered on the floor for fragrance, and candles lit to soften the atmosphere. A peasant couple was more likely to be escorted to the single room that served as the family's entire living space, where the bed, such as it was, occupied one corner and the rest of life happened in the other three. Privacy, in the modern sense of a door you could close and a space that belonged only to you, was not part of the arrangement. Privacy was a luxury, and luxury was not on the menu tonight. What was on the menu was ritual, community, and the formal, witnessed transition from courtship to marriage in the fullest physical sense. The bedding ceremony varied enormously across regions, classes, and centuries, and it is important not to flatten these variations into a single lurid image. In its most formal aristocratic version, the ceremony was elaborate and ritualized. The couple was escorted to the bedchamber by the wedding party. The priest came too, because the church had inserted itself into this moment with the same determination it had brought to every other part of the marriage process. The bed was blessed. Holy water was sprinkled. Prayers were said over the couple and over the bed itself, asking God to make the union fruitful and to protect the couple from demonic interference, because medieval theology held that the marriage bed was a site of particular spiritual vulnerability. The devil, it was believed, took a special interest in the moment of consummation, and the blessing was a defensive measure against his attention. You were not just having sex, you were having sex in a theologically contested space, and the church wanted to make sure God got there first. The room itself, in the cases where a separate chamber existed, was prepared with a care that reflected the significance of what was about to happen. Fresh rushes on the floor, sometimes mixed with dried lavender or rosemary for their scent. The bed would have been made with the household's best linens, which for a peasant family meant the linens that had been woven, bleached, and stored specifically for occasions that mattered. The mattress, stuffed with straw or wool or feathers, depending on the family's means, would have been freshly filled. Candles provided a soft, warm light that was both practical and atmospheric. The overall effect was an attempt to transform an ordinary sleeping space into something that marked the occasion as different from every other night. You can hear the effort in the details. These were people who had very little, making that very little look as much like something as they possibly could, for a night that was supposed to change everything. For a peasant couple with no separate chamber, the bedding ceremony was necessarily more compact, but it was not absent. The community still gathered around the bed. The priest still offered a blessing, if a priest was available. The transition from public celebration to private intimacy still happened. It just happened in a corner of the room while the rest of the household negotiated the delicate fiction of being asleep. The idea that peasant weddings were casual, throwaway affairs without ritual or ceremony is wrong. The rituals were smaller. They were not less meaningful. A family with one room and one bed still understood that this night was different, and they marked it as best they could with the resources they had. After the blessing, the couple was put to bed. In some traditions, friends and family helped remove the couple's outer garments, a process that could range from gently ceremonial to raucously playful, depending on the crowd and the ale consumption. Stockings were sometimes thrown. There was a tradition in some regions of throwing the bride's stocking over the shoulder, with the person who caught it believed to be the next to marry, a custom that echoes forward through the centuries into the modern tradition of throwing the bouquet. The couple was tucked into bed, the curtains were drawn if curtains existed, and the assembled company withdrew. Or did they? This is where the accounts diverge, and the modern imagination tends to sprint toward the most dramatic version. In some traditions, particularly in certain aristocratic and continental European contexts, witnesses lingered. The consummation of the marriage had legal significance, and in a world where legal proof depended on human testimony rather than documentary evidence, Having witnesses to the act, or at least to the immediate aftermath, served a practical purpose. A marriage that was not consummated could be annulled. A marriage whose consummation could be attested by reliable witnesses was significantly harder to challenge. The witnesses were not there for entertainment. They were there as insurance. The degree of witnessing varied. In some cases, witnesses waited outside the door and listened. In others, they remained in the room but at a distance, with curtains drawn around the bed. In the most extreme accounts, particularly from royal and high aristocratic marriages, where the political stakes of consummation were enormous, witnesses observed more directly. These extreme cases were not the norm. They were the exception, driven by the specific political necessity of proving beyond any possible doubt that a dynastic marriage had been fully completed. When the inheritance of a kingdom or the validity of a peace treaty depended on whether two people had actually had sex, the standards of evidence escalated accordingly. For the vast majority of medieval couples, the bedding ceremony was far less dramatic. Friends escorted you to bed, someone said a prayer, someone else made a joke. The door closed, or the curtain was drawn, or the guests simply moved to the other side of the room and pretended to be interested in something else. The morning would bring its own evidence and its own ritual, and the community would assess the results with the same frank pragmatism it brought to everything else. The modern equivalent of the bedding ceremony is the wedding party banging on the honeymoon suite door at midnight. Except in the medieval version, they actually came inside and prayed over you first. The invasion of privacy is recognizable. The spiritual anxiety is not. We have kept the intrusion and dropped the theology, which may or may not represent progress. Now, the morning. The morning after the wedding night carried its own significance, and in some traditions, its own ceremony. The morning gift, the morgengabe, which we have already discussed as a financial instrument, was delivered at this point. The groom gave the bride her personal property, the asset that was hers alone, on the morning after consummation. The timing was not accidental. The morning gift was triggered by, and contingent upon, the physical completion of the marriage. It was, in the bluntest possible terms, payment rendered after services confirmed. That framing is deliberately uncomfortable, because the medieval relationship between sex, property, and legal status was deliberately uncomfortable, tangling together the most intimate human act with the most impersonal economic mechanisms in ways that the modern mind instinctively recoils from, but the medieval mind accepted as entirely logical. In some traditions, particularly in Mediterranean and Southern European contexts, the evidence of consummation was displayed. The bloodied sheet, proof of the bride's virginity, was shown to the wedding party or even hung from a window for public inspection. This practice was more common in some cultures than others, and was by no means universal across medieval Europe. In England, the evidence suggests it was less standard than in Mediterranean regions, though the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the topic remains debated among historians. What is clear is that the bride's virginity was considered a matter of public, not private concern. It was an asset. A virgin bride was worth more in the marriage market than a bride whose virginity was in question, not because medieval men were more possessive than modern men, though they certainly were, but because virginity was a guarantee of legitimate paternity, and legitimate paternity was a guarantee of legitimate inheritance, and legitimate inheritance was the foundation of every economic arrangement the marriage was built upon. The blood on the sheet was not about purity in the abstract. It was about property. The gap between the ritual of the wedding night and the reality of the wedding night is worth acknowledging. Medieval people were people. They were nervous. They were excited. They were exhausted from a day of celebration. They had been drinking. They were in a room that might or might not contain other people, or at least the awareness that other people were directly on the other side of a very thin wall. The idea that every medieval wedding night was a smooth, ritualized transition from feast to bed to consummation to morning gift is a fantasy imposed on the past by people who have never tried to be intimate while their entire family was pretending not to listen in the next room. Some wedding nights went well. Some went awkwardly. Some went badly. The human experience of a first night together is one of the few things in history that genuinely has not changed, despite every effort by every institution to regulate, ritualize, and dignify it into something more orderly than it actually is. And that question of regulation brings us to the institution that had the most to say about what happened in the marriage bed, and somehow managed to say all of it at extraordinary length and with extraordinary specificity: the church. And the church's relationship with marital sex is one of the strangest, most contradictory, and most inadvertently hilarious chapters in the entire history of human sexuality. Let us start with what the church was not. The church was not against sex, not exactly. The popular image of the medieval church as a monolithic institution dedicated to the suppression of all sexual pleasure is a caricature, and like most caricatures, it contains just enough truth to be misleading and just enough exaggeration to be unfair. The church's actual position was more nuanced, more internally contradictory, and far more interesting than the simple narrative of repression allows. The church taught that marital sex was not only permitted, but, under certain circumstances, obligatory. This obligation had a name: the conjugal debt. It came from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, the passage where Paul instructs married couples that they do not have authority over their own bodies, but that authority belongs to their spouse. The medieval church interpreted this with characteristically literal precision. Either spouse could demand sex, and the other spouse was obligated to comply. Refusing the conjugal debt was a sin. A husband who denied his wife sex was sinning. A wife who denied her husband sex was sinning. The obligation was mutual, which is a detail that often surprises people who assume the medieval church was exclusively concerned with male sexual access. It was not. The conjugal debt ran in both directions, and church courts heard cases from wives complaining that their husbands were failing to fulfill it. So sex was permitted. Sex was obligatory. Sex was a mutual right embedded in the sacrament of marriage. The church was fine with sex, except, and this is a very large except, the church was fine with a very specific kind of sex, performed in a very specific way, on a very specific set of days, for a very specific reason, and everything outside those parameters was a sin requiring penance. The approved parameters were as follows: sex was for procreation, pleasure was suspect. A couple who had sex purely for enjoyment, even within marriage, even within the bonds of the sacrament, was committing a venial sin. The intention mattered. If you wanted a child, the act was sanctified. If you simply wanted each other, the act was tolerated, but spiritually compromised. The distinction between wanting a baby and wanting your spouse is, it must be said, a spectacularly difficult line to police, and the church's efforts to police it produced a body of theological and legal writing that ranges from the earnestly sincere to the unintentionally absurd. The approved position was what later centuries would call the missionary position. Man on top, woman on the bottom, face to face. Any other configuration was a sin. The reasoning was partly theological, something about the natural order and the proper hierarchy of creation, and partly practical, in that the approved position was considered the most conducive to conception. Positions that the church considered unnatural, a category that was defined with a specificity that suggests someone had spent a great deal of time thinking about the alternatives, required penance. The penitentials, the handbooks that priests used to assign penances for sins confessed, cataloged sexual variations with the detail and organizational rigor of a particularly thorough instruction manual. The penitentials are, for the modern reader, an astonishing body of literature. They list, in calm, methodical prose, every sexual act the medieval church considered sinful, along with the specific penance required for each. The penances were scaled by severity. Sex, in an unapproved position, might require a penance of a few days of fasting. Sex, during a prohibited period, might require longer. Specific acts that the church considered particularly grave could carry penances of years. The level of detail suggests either an extraordinary commitment to moral thoroughness or a deeply uncomfortable familiarity with the subject matter, or, most likely, both. What the penitentials reveal, perhaps inadvertently, is the extraordinary range of sexual behavior that medieval people were actually engaging in. The church would not have needed to prohibit specific acts in such detail if those acts were not happening. Every prohibition is, in a sense, a census. A penitential that dedicates a paragraph to a particular sexual variation is a penitential that has encountered that variation often enough to require a standardized response. The penitentials are not a list of theoretical sins. They are a catalog of observed behavior, compiled by priests who sat in confession and heard, week after week, month after month, what their parishioners were actually doing, and then wrote it all down in the hope that having a rule and a corresponding penance would somehow make it stop. It did not make it stop, but it made extremely interesting reading for historians a few centuries later. The practical experience of confession itself added another layer of complexity. A priest hearing confession was supposed to ask about sexual sins, but he was also warned not to ask too specifically, because detailed questioning might introduce the penitent to sins they had not previously considered. This created a genuinely impossible bind. The priest needed to identify the sin to assign the correct penance. But identifying the sin required asking about it, and asking about it risked teaching the penitent something they did not know was possible. The pastoral literature on this topic is full of anxious advice about how to navigate the conversation without accidentally providing a sexual education, and the anxiety in the writing suggests that the line was crossed regularly. Confession was supposed to be a tool for moral correction. It was also, by structural necessity, an information exchange, and information, once exchanged, could not be unexchanged. And then there were the forbidden days. This is where the Church's regulation of marital sex reaches its most spectacularly ambitious and most spectacularly unenforceable extreme. Medieval married couples were prohibited from having sex on Sundays, because Sunday was the Lord's Day. They were prohibited on Wednesdays and Fridays, because those were days of fasting and abstinence. They were prohibited during the entire season of Lent, the 40 days before Easter. They were prohibited during Advent, the period before Christmas. They were prohibited on the feast days of major saints, and there were a lot of major saints. They were prohibited during the wife's menstrual period. They were prohibited during pregnancy, at least according to the stricter interpretations. They were prohibited for 40 days after childbirth. They were prohibited on the night before taking communion. The historian James Brundage, who studied these prohibitions with the patience they deserve, calculated the total. If a medieval couple obeyed every single restriction, every prohibited day, every liturgical season, every saint's day, every biological exclusion, they would have been left with approximately 4 or 5 available days per month in which marital sex was permitted. 4 or 5 days out of 30. The Church had, with the best of theological intentions, constructed a regulatory framework that prohibited married couples from having sex for roughly 80 to 85% of the calendar year. Modern couples with small children report similar statistics for entirely different reasons. The result is the same. The path to it is spectacularly different. The question, of course, is whether anyone actually followed these rules. The answer, with equal confidence, is almost certainly not. Or at least, not consistently, not completely, and not without the kind of creative reinterpretation that human beings have always brought to rules they find inconvenient. The gap between what the Church taught and what people did in the privacy of their own beds or their own corners of a shared room was enormous. Church court records suggest widespread non-compliance. Penitential literature assumes a constant need for correction. The sheer volume of repetitive injunctions against forbidden sexual behavior is itself evidence that the behavior was happening with a frequency that the church found alarming and that the laity found perfectly natural. An institution publishing extremely detailed rules about what consenting married adults are allowed to do in their own bed, and then being genuinely surprised when nobody follows them, is not a uniquely medieval phenomenon. It is a pattern that repeats across centuries and cultures with a consistency that suggests something fundamental about the relationship between institutional authority and private human behavior. The rules exist, the rules are clear, the rules are ignored, the institution expresses disappointment. The people continue doing what they were going to do anyway. Everybody involved understands that this is how it works, and everybody involved continues performing their part in the cycle with a sincerity that is, in its way, almost touching. The Church's reasoning behind all of these regulations was not arbitrary, even if the results were absurd. At the core of medieval sexual theology was a genuine and deeply held belief that the body was a site of spiritual danger. Sex, even marital sex, even procreative sex, performed in the approved position on an approved day with approved intentions, was an act that brought the soul into proximity with sin. The pleasure of sex was itself the problem. Augustine had argued that sexual pleasure was a consequence of the fall, that in the Garden of Eden sex had been possible without lust, and that the uncontrollable nature of sexual desire was evidence of humanity's broken relationship with God. The medieval church inherited this framework and built an entire regulatory apparatus on top of it, an apparatus designed to minimize the spiritual damage of an act that was simultaneously necessary for the continuation of the species and dangerous to the souls of the people performing it. This produced a theology of married sex that was, at its heart, a theology of damage control. Sex was necessary, sex was permitted, sex was obligatory. But sex was also spiritually hazardous, and every regulation, every forbidden day, every approved position, every requirement that the act be performed for procreative rather than pleasurable purposes was an attempt to contain the hazard within manageable boundaries. The Church was not trying to eliminate sex. It was trying to fireproof the building while allowing a controlled burn inside it, and the regulations were the fire breaks. The lived experience of all this, for actual medieval married couples lying in their actual beds on an actual Tuesday evening, was probably something closer to negotiation than compliance. Some couples were devout and tried to follow the rules. Some couples were selective, observing the major prohibitions like Lent, while cheerfully ignoring the minor ones. Some couples paid no attention whatsoever and confessed the results later, knowing that the penance for unapproved sex was usually a few days of fasting, which was a price most people were willing to pay. The penitential system itself functioned as a kind of moral pricing mechanism. Every sin had a cost. Every cost was bearable. The Church had accidentally created a fee structure for misbehavior, and people treated it the way people have always treated fee structures. They calculated whether the transaction was worth the price, and they usually concluded that it was. What is most striking about the medieval church's regulation of marital sex is not its ambition, though the ambition was extraordinary. It is the gap between the regulation and the reality, the enormous, unbridgeable distance between what the church wrote in its penitentials and what people actually did in the dark. That gap is not evidence of medieval hypocrisy. It is evidence of medieval humanity. The rules were an ideal. The behavior was real. And in the space between the ideal and the real, ordinary people lived their ordinary married lives with the same mixture of desire, affection, guilt, pragmatism, and cheerful noncompliance that married people have brought to institutional sexual regulation in every century since. The Church wanted a regulated marriage bed. What it got was a marriage bed that nodded politely at the regulations and then did whatever it was going to do anyway. The regulations survive in the archives, meticulously catalogued and precisely worded. The behavior survives in the population statistics, which suggest quite clearly that medieval couples were not, on the whole, restricting themselves to 4 available days per month. The theology was sincere, the biology was unimpressed, and the result was a centuries-long conversation between an institution that believed it could legislate desire and a species that has never once, in its entire history, allowed anyone to successfully do so. The softening begins here. The questions that remain, the ones about what daily married life actually looked like, about who had rights and who had none, about what happened when a marriage failed. These are quieter questions. The loud surprises are behind us. What comes next is the texture of ordinary life inside these structures. The weight of them felt not as spectacle, but as routine. And that weight was distributed very differently, depending on whether you were rich or poor, male or female, lucky or not. The wedding is over. The feast has been eaten. The bed has been blessed and occupied and survived. The morning gift has been given. The community has assessed the ale, judged the bread, and filed its conclusions. And now the part begins that nobody writes songs about, the marriage itself. The daily, ordinary, unromantic reality of sharing a life with another person inside a system that has opinions about every aspect of how you do it. And here is where the biggest status flip of this entire story lives, quietly, in the details that popular history almost never bothers to examine. Because the assumption, the one that sits underneath every period drama and every casual reference to medieval marriage, is that noble marriages were grand and peasant marriages were nothing, that aristocratic couples lived in splendor while peasant couples existed in a kind of gray, interchangeable misery, their marriages as dull and featureless as the mud they worked in. The reality is almost exactly reversed, and the reversal is worth sitting with because it says something important about what marriage actually is when you strip away the spectacle. Noble marriages were politically spectacular. The ceremonies were lavish. The dowries were enormous. The guest lists read like a census of the ruling class, but the couple at the center of all that spectacle often barely knew each other. They might have met days before the wedding. They might have exchanged a few formal letters. They might have nothing in common except the political alliance their families had decided to pursue. And after the wedding, they might not even live together. It was not uncommon for noble spouses to maintain separate households, sometimes in separate regions of the country, seeing each other for occasional visits that were as much diplomatic as personal. The husband had his estates, his political obligations, his military service. The wife had her own estates to manage, her own household to run, her own social and political role to perform. They were married in law. They were partners in strategy. They were not necessarily partners in daily life. The emotional distance this created is visible in the records, if you know where to look. Letters between noble spouses are sometimes warm, but they are also sometimes purely administrative. Reports on estate management, updates on political developments, requests for money or resources, with no more personal feeling than a memo between business associates. There are noble marriages that lasted decades and produced children and generated no surviving evidence of affection whatsoever. The absence of evidence is not proof of absence. People may have felt things they did not write down, but the contrast with what survives from lower down the social scale is striking. Peasant marriages were different, not because peasants were more romantic by nature, but because the structure of peasant life made emotional distance almost physically impossible. You lived together, in one room. You woke together, ate together, worked together, slept together, in a space so small that being alone required leaving the house entirely. Your marriage was not a political alliance conducted across separate estates. It was a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute partnership in the business of survival, and the closeness it produced was not optional. It was architectural. What a Tuesday morning looked like inside a functioning peasant marriage is worth pausing on. because it is in the ordinary details that the real texture of these relationships becomes visible. You wake before dawn. The room is cold because the fire burned low overnight. Your spouse is beside you, or already up, stirring the embers and adding wood. There is no privacy. There is no separation. The day's work begins immediately, and it is shared work, divided by custom and practicality, but interdependent at every point. He works the strips in the field. She manages the household, the garden, the chickens, the pig, the dairy, if they have a cow, the spinning and weaving, the brewing of ale, the cooking, the child rearing, the endless cycle of domestic production that keeps the household functioning. His labor produces the grain. Her labor produces everything else. Neither can survive without the other. The partnership is not romantic in the candlelit sense. It is romantic in the structural sense. Two people whose daily existence is so completely interwoven that the removal of either one would collapse the entire system. The evidence of affection in peasant marriages comes not from love letters, because peasants generally did not write letters, but from the traces they left in the records they could not avoid. Wills, written by the village priest on behalf of a dying husband, leave everything to my dear wife, with language that goes beyond legal formula into something that sounds personal, chosen, meant. Court records show spouses defending each other in legal disputes at personal cost and risk. Land transfers show husbands and wives managing property jointly, making decisions together, appearing in manor court as a unit rather than as a man with an appendage. There are cases of widows and widowers petitioning to be buried beside their spouse, requesting that the grave be dug close enough that the two could lie together in death as they had in life. These are not the grand gestures of courtly romance. They are the small, stubborn gestures of people who shared a bed, a table, a room, a life, and found something in that sharing that they wanted to carry beyond its end. The grander the wedding, the less likely the couple actually knew each other. The smaller the wedding, the more likely the marriage was built on something real. The peasant couple who fell asleep each night in the same narrow bed, exhausted from the same long day, breathing the same smoky air, had something the Duke and Duchess in their separate chambers often did not. Proximity. And proximity, over years, over decades, over the slow accumulation of shared meals and shared crises, and shared winter nights when the wind came through the walls, has a way of becoming something that looks very much like love, even when nobody planned for it to. But the warmth of that picture should not obscure the weight of the system that sat on top of it, and that weight fell unevenly. Because the question of what rights a married woman actually had is one of the places where medieval marriage law reveals its deepest contradictions, and the answer is both worse and better than you expect. The legal framework was stark. Under the English common law doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property independently. She could not enter into contracts. She could not sue or be sued in her own name. She could not make a will without her husband's consent. In the eyes of the common law, husband and wife were one person, and that person was the husband. The wife did not disappear legally. She was subsumed. Her identity did not end. It merged, and the merger was not equal. This sounds like total subjugation, and in its strictest application, it was. But the strictest application was not the only application, and the lived reality of married women's lives was significantly more complex than the legal summary allows. Coverture was the common law framework. It was not the only framework. Customary law, the local rules that governed individual manors and villages, often provided women with rights that common law did not recognize. Church law, as we have seen, insisted on women's consent in marriage and provided avenues for women to petition church courts on matters of marital dispute. Borough law, the rules governing towns and cities, sometimes offered even more. In London and several other English boroughs, a married woman could register as a femme sole, a woman alone for trading purposes. This status allowed her to conduct business, enter contracts, incur debts, and be sued in her own name, entirely independent of her husband's legal identity. A femme sole was married in the eyes of God and the common law, but she was single in the eyes of the commercial marketplace. The status was not common, but it existed, and the women who used it ran businesses, managed apprentices, traded in goods, and operated as independent economic agents within a legal system that theoretically denied them the capacity to do any of those things. The gap between what the law said a married woman could not do and what married women actually did is one of the most instructive gaps in medieval legal history. Even without femme sole status, married women in practice exercised economic agency that coverture would seem to prohibit. A peasant wife who brewed ale for sale, who sold eggs and cheese and dairy products at market, who managed the household's finances and decided how resources were allocated, was performing economic functions that the common law did not technically allow her to perform. But nobody stopped her, because the household economy depended on her performing them. The law said one thing, the economy required another, and when the law and the economy disagree, the economy usually wins, quietly, without anyone formally acknowledging that the law has been set aside. The dower right was the most significant legal protection a married woman possessed, and it is worth understanding both its power and its limits. A widow was entitled to 1/3 of her husband's real property, held for life. In some regions, and under some customary laws, the share was 1/2. This was not a gift. It was a right, established at the time of marriage and enforceable in court. A husband could not disinherit his wife by selling off his property before death, because dower attached to the property at the moment of marriage and followed it regardless of subsequent transfers. In theory, in practice, dower was a right that often had to be fought for. A widow claiming her dower might face resistance from her husband's heirs, particularly if the estate was small and the widow's third represented resources the heirs needed. Manor court records are full of dower disputes, widows petitioning for their share, heirs contesting the claim, courts attempting to mediate between competing needs with limited resources. The widow who received her dower smoothly, without challenge, without delay, without the grinding bureaucratic friction of a legal system that moved slowly and favored those who could afford to wait, was fortunate. Many were not fortunate. The value of dower rights was not trivial. A widow's guaranteed third of a knight's estate could represent a substantial income, enough to live independently, manage a household, and exercise genuine economic autonomy for the remainder of her life. Expressed in labor terms, the dower from a moderately prosperous estate might represent the equivalent of a skilled worker's income for decades. This was not pocket money. It was an economic foundation, and the women who held it wielded real influence in their communities, as landlords, as employers, as economic actors whose decisions affected the people around them. Widows, in fact, occupied a peculiar and powerful position in medieval society. A widow with dower rights was often the most economically autonomous woman in her community. She was no longer under her father's authority. She was no longer under her husband's authority. She held property in her own right. She could make contracts. She could appear in court. She could, if she chose, manage her own affairs with a freedom that neither maidens nor married women typically enjoyed. This autonomy made widows simultaneously respected and vulnerable. Respected because they controlled resources. Vulnerable because they controlled resources that other people wanted, and the legal system that protected their rights was imperfect and slow. There is a quiet tragedy visible in the court records, one that appears as a pattern rather than a single story. A woman whose husband dies. She petitions for her dower. The husband's family contests. The case moves through the courts. Months pass. Years, sometimes. The widow appears again and again in the records. Each petition a little more desperate. Each appearance a little more diminished. The family produces witnesses who challenge her claims. The costs of litigation accumulate, and then, in some cases, The woman's name simply stops appearing. She vanishes from the record. Did she accept a reduced settlement? Did she give up? Did she remarry, surrendering her independence in exchange for the security of another household? Did she die? The records do not say. They rarely do. The silence where her name should be is the loudest thing in the document. The system was not designed to be cruel. It was designed to be orderly, to allocate resources according to rules that balanced competing claims and prevented chaos. But orderly systems produce disorderly outcomes when the people inside them have unequal power. And the people inside this system had profoundly unequal power. A widow with resources, connections, and legal knowledge could navigate the system and emerge with her rights intact. A widow without those advantages could be ground down by it, slowly, invisibly, in the bureaucratic silence of court rolls that recorded outcomes without recording suffering. What emerges from all of this is not a simple story of oppression, though oppression was real and pervasive. It is a story of contradiction. A legal system that denied women independent identity coexisted with an economic system that depended on women's independent labor. A church that insisted on women's consent in marriage presided over a society that made meaningful consent almost impossible for the poorest women. A dower right that protected widows on paper failed to protect them in practice when the people contesting their claims had more patience, more money, and more access to the courts. The rights were real. The limits on those rights were also real. And in the space between the right and the limit, real women lived real lives that were neither the total subjugation of the popular myth nor the empowered autonomy of a modern fantasy. The energy settles here. The analytical questions are thinning. What remains is the part that every marriage, in every century, eventually arrives at. The question of what happens when it ends. When love fails, or patience fails, or circumstances fail, or one person simply walks away. The medieval world had answers to that question. They were complicated, expensive, and almost never fair. Divorce did not exist in medieval England. That is the simple answer, the one that gets repeated in classrooms and documentaries. And, in the strictest technical sense, it is true. The Catholic Church did not grant divorce as the modern world understands it, the dissolution of a valid marriage with the freedom to remarry. What God had joined, the Church maintained, no human authority could separate. The bond of marriage was permanent, indissoluble, eternal. You were married until one of you died. That was the rule. It was also not quite the whole story. Because while the word divorce in its modern sense did not apply, the medieval world had developed a surprisingly flexible set of mechanisms for getting out of a marriage that was no longer wanted, no longer functional, or no longer politically useful. The mechanisms were complicated, they were expensive, they were slow, and they were almost never available to the people who needed them most. But they existed, and they were used, and the ways in which they were used reveal a great deal about the gap between what the Church taught and what the world required. The first and most powerful escape route was annulment. An annulment was not a divorce. It was a declaration that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, that some impediment had existed from the beginning that rendered the union void. The distinction mattered enormously to the Church, because an annulment did not violate the principle of indissolubility. You were not breaking a valid marriage. You were revealing that a valid marriage had never existed. The sacrament was intact. It had simply never occurred. The grounds for annulment were more numerous and more flexible than a modern person might expect. Consanguinity, blood relationship within a prohibited degree of kinship, was the most commonly exploited loophole. The Church prohibited marriage between people related within the fourth degree, which, in the medieval method of counting, meant anyone who shared a great-great-great-grandparent. In a small community where families had been intermarrying for generations, almost everyone was related within the fourth degree to almost everyone else. This meant that a convenient discovery of a previously overlooked family connection could provide grounds for annulment at any point during a marriage, regardless of how long it had lasted or how many children it had produced. The aristocracy exploited this loophole with a creative enthusiasm that the church found embarrassing but could not easily prevent. A noble who wanted out of a politically inconvenient marriage could commission a genealogical investigation, discover a distant family connection that had somehow escaped notice during the original bans, and petition the church court for annulment on the grounds of consanguinity. The investigation was often sincere. The genealogical records were often accurate, the timing of the discovery arriving conveniently just as the marriage had outlived its political usefulness was the part that strained credulity. Discovering a suddenly convenient distant family connection to get out of a marriage you no longer want is the medieval equivalent of finding a loophole in a contract. The lawyers were different. The motivation was identical. Other grounds for annulment included prior contract, the discovery that one party had been previously married or betrothed, which would invalidate the subsequent marriage, impotence, which we have already encountered in the context of the bedding ceremony, coercion, the absence of free consent, and spiritual affinity, a relationship created by the sacrament of baptism, so that a man who served as godfather to a woman's child was considered spiritually related to her and could not marry her. Each of these grounds required evidence, witnesses, legal argument, and the patience to navigate a church court system that moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of an institution that had all of eternity to get things right. The cost of an annulment was prohibitive for anyone below the gentry. An annulment hearing in a church court required legal representation because the arguments were conducted in Latin and involved canon law principles that a layperson could not be expected to navigate. It required witnesses who might need to travel and who expected compensation for their time. It required fees to the court, fees to the notary, fees for the documentation. The total cost could represent months or even years of a laborer's income. Annulment was a rich person's escape route, and the records confirm this. The vast majority of annulment cases that survive in the church court records involve families of means. The peasant couple trapped in a miserable marriage did not petition the church court for an annulment. They could not afford to. What the peasant couple did, in many cases, was simply separate. The second mechanism for ending a marriage was legal separation, known as divorce a mensa et thoro, divorce from bed and board. This was not a dissolution of the marriage. It was a formal recognition that the couple could live apart, with separate households and separate economic arrangements, but without the freedom to remarry. The grounds for legal separation included adultery, cruelty, and heresy. The church court could order a separation and could set terms for the financial support of the separated wife, but neither party could marry again. They were separated, but still married, freed from each other's company, but still bound by the sacrament. The third mechanism was the simplest and by far the most common: abandonment. A husband who wanted out of his marriage could simply leave, walk away, move to another village, another town, another county. In a world without centralized records, without national identification systems, without any mechanism for tracking the movements of ordinary people, a man could disappear and start a new life somewhere else with relative ease. He might remarry, illegally but undetectably, in a parish where nobody knew him. He might simply live as a single man. He might send money back. He might not. The wife he left behind had no practical recourse. She could not remarry because her husband might still be alive. She could not claim widow's rights because she was not a widow. She was trapped in a legal limbo that the system had no name for and no solution to. The husband who simply disappeared is traceable in the records as a gradually expanding silence. A name that appears in the manor court rolls for years, paying rents, attending courts, fulfilling obligations, and then stops. Unanswered summonses, unpaid debts that accumulate in the margins of the rolls, and then his wife, appearing alone, listed neither as wife nor as widow, petitioning for the right to work land that was technically still her husband's. asking for the community's recognition of a situation that the law could not quite describe. The slow erosion of a life that the records can document but cannot explain. Did he die on the road? Did he find someone else? Did he simply decide that the weight of this particular life was more than he was willing to carry? The court rolls do not say. They record the debt. They record the petition. They record the silence. They do not record the reason. The gendered consequences of marriage dissolution were starkly unequal. A man who left a marriage lost his home, but kept his mobility, his earning capacity, and his ability to start again. A woman who was left lost nearly everything. Her legal identity was still merged with her husband's. Her economic foundation, the household they had built together, was legally his. Her dower rights could not be activated because he was not dead. She was frozen, a woman with a husband who was gone, and a legal status that no longer matched her reality. The community might support her. The community might not. The church might help. The church might not. What the system could not do was give her back the years, the labor, the dowry she had brought into a marriage that had been abandoned by the person the system had designated as her other half. And yet, for all the weight of the system, for all the harshness of the economics, and the invasiveness of the church, and the cruelty of abandonment, and the impossibility of divorce, there is one more myth left to dismantle, and it is perhaps the most important one. The myth that medieval marriage was universally miserable, that the system was so oppressive, so cold, so relentlessly transactional that no genuine happiness could survive inside it, that the people who lived through all of this, the negotiations and the fines, and the bedding ceremonies, and the penitentials, and the dower disputes, emerged from the experience diminished, ground down, emptied of whatever warmth they might once have carried. This is the myth that flatters the present most. The idea that we have progressed beyond the cruelty of the past, that our marriages are freer, warmer, more human than theirs could ever have been. And like every comfortable lie we have dismantled tonight, it contains just enough truth to be dangerous, and not nearly enough to be honest. The evidence of love in medieval marriages is not abundant. It is scattered, fragile, and easy to miss if you are not looking for it. But it is there, written in the margins of documents that were never intended to carry emotional weight. It is there in the letters. The past and family correspondence, which has accompanied us throughout this story, contains moments of tenderness that survive the centuries with their warmth intact. Richard Calais, the estate manager who married Marjorie against her family's wishes, wrote letters to her during their separation that ache with longing. The words are formal by modern standards. The feeling behind them is not. He wrote because he missed her. He wrote because the distance was unbearable. He wrote because love, whatever the system thought of it, was real to him, and the only way he could reach her was through ink and parchment, and the hope that someone would carry his words to where she was. It is there in the wills, husbands leaving their wives, not just the legally required portion, but everything, every possession, every asset, with language that a notary would not have required, and a dying man would not have bothered with unless he meant it. My beloved wife, my dear companion, the woman who has shared my life. These phrases appear in wills from every level of society, from knights to prosperous peasants, and they appear too consistently and too specifically to be explained away as legal formula. A man dictating his will to a priest, knowing he was dying, chose those words. He did not have to. He wanted to. It is there in the court records, in the testimony of spouses who defended each other at personal risk. A wife who testified for her husband in a land dispute, knowing that her testimony might anger powerful neighbors. A husband who petitioned the court on his wife's behalf when she was cheated in a transaction. These are not grand romantic gestures. They are the small daily acts of partnership that accumulate over years into something that looks, from every available angle, like devotion. It is there in the tomb inscriptions. Couples who asked to be buried together, side by side, with epitaphs that requested God to reunite in heaven what death had separated on earth. There is a particular kind of grief visible in these inscriptions, the grief of someone who has lost not a legal partner or an economic unit, but a person, a specific, irreplaceable person, whose absence has left a hole that no amount of dower rights or remarriage can fill. And it is there in the simplest, most quietly powerful piece of evidence of all: the clandestine marriages. Every couple who exchanged vows in secret, defying family, defying the Lord, defying the church's procedural requirements, did so because what they felt for each other was more powerful than what the system felt about them. They risked penances, they risked disinheritance, they risked the legal chaos of an unprovable marriage. They did it anyway, not because they were reckless, because they were in love, and love, in the medieval world as in every world, did not wait for permission. Writing "I love you" and "I miss you" and "please come home soon" in a letter to a spouse who is away is not modern, it is human. The handwriting changes across the centuries. The feeling does not. So tonight, as you lie here in your warm bed, in your quiet room, with the hum of whatever century you belong to softening around you, spare a gentle thought for them, the real ones, not the cartoon figures from the history books or the romantic silhouettes from the films, but the actual people. The woman who stood in front of a bishop and said, "Yes, I chose him," knowing her family would never forgive her. The man who carved a spoon by candlelight, hoping it would say what his voice could not. The widow who appeared in court, year after year, fighting for the third she was owed, until the records went quiet and her name disappeared. The couple who fell asleep each night in the same narrow bed, in the same cold room, after the same long day, and found in that exhausted closeness something worth keeping. They were not simpler than you. They were not colder. They were not less capable of love, or less desperate for connection, or less foolish in the pursuit of it. They were people, navigating love inside systems they did not design, making choices between what they wanted and what they could afford, finding warmth in the cracks of structures that were never built to contain it, exactly the way you do, exactly the way everyone always has. The systems changed, the contracts changed, the churches and the laws and the economics changed. But the feeling, the one that makes a person carve a spoon, or write a letter, or whisper vows in a barn when nobody is listening, that feeling has not changed. It has not even tried to change. It is the same tonight as it was 700 years ago, stubborn and irrational, and completely unwilling to read the fine print before committing. Rest easy now. Let the old stories settle softly around you like something warm and familiar. The past was never a tidy story with simple lessons. It was messier, funnier, and far more human than that. Breathe slow, let your shoulders drop, and let the quiet centuries fade gently into the dark.